Hello, my name is Steve Gerhardt, and this is the Unagi Observer. Today will be the first part of an ongoing series called Inyuasha's Japan. For us die-hard anime fans, we all know about Inyuasha, the tale where the descendant of a shrine priestess from the modern times falls down a well to the past in feudal Japan, where she meets up with Inyuasha, a dog demon, and others to combat evil in the pursuit of the Shikon Jewel fragments. The anime makes it a point to tell us in the beginning narrative that the story takes place at a certain point in Japan's history, the feudal age, also known as the Warring States period. And this is a period of time that I would like to talk about, in particular the moment in time that the Inyuasha anime actually occurs. I want to explain what Japan was like at that time, the government, warfare, religion, class structure, all sorts of stuff that appears in Inyuasha as well as in actual history. So, I want to start off the series by trying to pinpoint, roughly, the time that Inyuasha and Kagome's band are operating in. The series actually gives us plenty of clues as to that time period, but I'm going to focus in on a couple different elements. Also keep in mind that I am using a combination of historical fact and an element from the Inyuasha anime. The Inyuasha canon has a lot of historical inaccuracies, and I am aware of them. That's why I'm tying the historical and fictional events together. A really good major clue that we have has to do with episodes wherein firearms appear for the first time in Inyuasha. Some other stuff has to do with the Band of Seven's appearance and history of that fictional band. These episodes are important time markers. Now, the first real gunpowder weapon that we see in Inyuasha as it relates to the feudal period doesn't even occur until Season 4, Episode 87, Kikyo's Lonely Journey. In that episode, we see the villain Ryatsu use a fuse grenade. Now, before we talk about that hand grenade that appears in Inyuasha, let's talk about gunpowder. Gunpowder had been invented by the Chinese around 800 AD, and the first military use for it had been recorded around 1000 AD. And while gunpowder had been in trade with Japan during that time, for Japan it was really only used as entertainment as fireworks. However, the Chinese would create a bamboo grenade in the year 1468, and that idea traveled to Japan just a few years later. So while rare, there were a few Japanese hand grenades with fuses used starting in the late 1470s. Now we have a starting point roughly for when Inyuasha might have taken place, and we'll start with the year 1470. However, you see in Season 4, Episode 103, The Band of Seven Resurrected, Tanegashima matchlocks are used against the evil Band of Seven. This episode is notable because as the troops fire a volley at the Band of Seven, some distance later Inyuasha's band hears it and only Kagome recognizes it for what it is: gunshots. So why is that scene important? Well, here's why. The appearance of that Tanegashima matchlock in Inyuasha is important because we can now move the date of operations by Inyuasha's band from 1470, like I said before, to a more precise date of 1543. 1543 is when a Portuguese ship, damaged by a storm, washed up on the island of Tanegashima, and a number of matchlocks were traded for help to repair their ships so they can be on their way. The local lord tried replicating making the matchlocks, but was unsuccessful until the following year when the Portuguese came back to trade more and taught the local blacksmiths how to recreate a couple of pieces. After that, the matchlocks made in Japan were called Tanegashima matchlocks. And that means we can move up the calendar to 1544, where it may be possible that Inyuasha's band existed. Okay, here's a little side note. If you'd like to know more about Tanegashima matchlocks, please see the link down below. Click on that, and I did an episode strictly on that type of firearm. And yes, in that video I mistakenly referred to it as a flintlock. I know that. You don't need to remind me of the error. So now that we have a kind of sort of date, it leads us to the second part, which helps us narrow it down even further. And it leads us to another part that will help us pinpoint in the estimated time where Kagome and Inyuasha were wandering around. The Band of Seven, like many characters in Inyuasha, have a backstory. The Band of Seven were a group of mercenaries who were just too powerful and bloodthirsty for their own good. Now, the Inyuasha canon tells us they were executed by Tanegashima rifles, but historically that would be impossible given the years that was put in Inyuasha and what actually happened in history. That means the execution would have taken place 15 years prior to the introduction of the matchlock. Obviously, that can't happen. So I am purposely ignoring that canon historical error and going with the historical record. Given that in the anime, Tanegashima matchlocks were being used against the Band of Seven after the resurrection, and that there was a showing of a fuse grenade by the second in command of the band, there was also a show of volley fire against the Band of Seven. May not sound like much, but that is important. When Tanegashima matchlocks were introduced to Japan and then later spread out, they were used first as individual weapons by samurai. It wasn't until more Japanese lords who employed the matchlocks used them for lower ranking soldiers and devised techniques for the best maximum effect of the firearm. That would have meant the introduction of volley fire. That's a big deal when it comes to matchlocks, muskets, and early rifles. Now, here's why the technique of volley fire is important in pinpointing where Inyuasha would have operated in historical Japan. About what time period? There's this guy named Oda Nobunaga. You might have heard of him. He's very famous for being the first Japanese lord to almost unite Japan under one rule. And he used Tanegashima matchlocks as part of his army. And he used the volley technique to great effect. In 1549, he ordered 500 matchlocks to be made, the most that any army was using at that time, to be used for his volley fire technique. Because the Inyuasha episode shows what appears to be well-trained soldiers using the Tanegashima matchlocks, we can make an assumption that Inyuasha and Kagome were searching for the jewel shards somewhere between 1549 and 1550. And that means that the era that Japan was in was called the Sengoku period, or the Warring States period, that lasted from about 1467 to 1590. And because we can assume that Kagome was screaming "Sit boy sit" at Inyuasha around 1549-1550, we can also note that they were right in the middle of the Sengoku period, where the action was the hottest in historical Japan. Okay, now that we've kind of pinpointed the time period, the next Inyuasha's Japan will be about the Sengoku period. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that and how it relates to the anime. As always, my name is Steve Gearhart. This is the Unagi Observer, and as always again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.